That's right. I'm here with Dr. Sal Mercogliano of Campbell University. Sal, thanks for joining us this morning. So, Sal, you've seen the numbers. Just jumping into it, what's one of the biggest things that stands out so far?
Well, I mean, obviously the sanctions are hurting Russia, but one of the things that we're seeing is Russia's ability to get around the sanctions. So we've seen them doing everything from skin to skin transfers of fuel oil out in the middle of the Atlantic, which I have to say is most unusual. One of the things you tend to see is fuel transfers in protected waters and coastal waters, but now we're getting reports, Tanker Tracker, which is an outfit that tracks vessels and tankers in particularly to make sure that the loads on board are coming from non-sanctioned entities, has been monitoring and witnessed a operation take place in the Eastern Atlantic between tankers coming out of Russia and other vessels. So this is extremely precarious for a variety of reasons, not the least of which you could have an accident with these vessels and have a major oil spill in the middle of the Atlantic. This was off the Madeira Islands off the coast of Africa.
And with that, we don't need an environmental disaster on top of what's going on with the geopolitical disaster going on in the Russia-Ukraine space right now. What other risks are currently being run in the maritime space, whether that's just from dangers of the wartime effort or just from people trying to escape, the food shortages possibly going on there as well? What's going on in that space?
So there was an effort listed by Turkey. Turkey has been talking with Russia to try to open up these Ukrainian ports so that they can start getting grain out. And one of the things that's been broached is this idea of escorting vessels into the Ukrainian ports, start offloading. Again, if you look at last month, out of 6 million tons of wheat that was scheduled to be exported out of Ukraine, only about 1.5 million came out either through overland routes or using the very small ports on the very southern end of Ukraine on the Danube River. The problem with this is twofold. Number one, you have mines which were laid by the Ukrainians to prevent the Russians from landing in their ports. So you would have to do a mine countermeasures evolution that requires minesweepers, it requires mine counter vessels. It's a lot. It's a lot to do it because mines never stay where you lay them. They break loose, they drift. Very precarious. Second, the Russians have started to target Ukrainian grain facilities. While in the midst of negotiation, for example, at the port of Mykolaiv, they hit a major grain facility, lighting it on fire, igniting it. It's pretty much destroyed. And so you're getting these two different versions from the Russians. On one hand, they're saying, we're not the ones who mine the ports. We're open for humanitarian accesses. And matter of fact, one of the things they touted was there are Ukrainian ports open. They're the ones they've captured, Mariupol, Berdansk, and they're loading grain out of those ports right now, but they're Ukrainian grain loaded into Russian ships. And there's going to be a question whether or not those vessels get stopped hauling illegal Ukrainian grain on board ships that are not chartered or owned by the Ukrainian government.
And so, just as you mentioned here, it seems like saying one thing, doing the exact opposite here. With this, do you see any way that Russia is potentially trying to proposition themselves into having some of their sanctions lifted or easing some of their hardships in order to exchange for easier passage?
Russia's been leveraging everything from the very beginning. I mean, they're offering fuel at a discounted level. So there was a report last month that Russian oil exports are up, but revenues are down. And that's because they're charging less for their oil because they're trying to entice consumers to buy their oil. They're also making sure that that oil is being purchased with rubles. You heard a lot about the Russian ruble falling at the beginning of the conflict. Well, the Russian ruble now is stronger than it was at the beginning of the conflict. And that's Russia been shoring up their economy. And so Russia is all for leveraging whatever they can do to get their products and their material out. And again, what we're seeing is a lot of traffic still coming out of the Black Sea. Oil's moving, grain's moving from the Russian ports. We're seeing a lot of movement coming in. We thought we were going to see it slow down because of the potential war risk and higher rates, but that's not the case right now. The other thing that we're seeing, too, is a lot of Central Asian countries that use the Black Sea for their ports are making sure to differentiate their cargo. Kazakhstan, which offloads a lot of oil into the Black Sea through a Russian port, is making sure everybody knows that the oil going in specific tankers is Kazakhstan. One of the most unusual players right now in the Black Sea is China, because China has developed a large overland railway system prior to the war. They had built up this huge railway system that went all the way from Shanghai to Germany. And that was stopped because of the war. However, what they have done is diverted those rails down to the Black Sea. And a lot of that cargo now is transiting across the Black Sea to Romania, to Black Sea ports in Europe, and moving on. And so you have nations like China, for example, do not want to see any issues on the Black Sea. They're depending on this for the movement of high value cargo.
Sal, I want to pivot really quickly to the topic that we were talking to Henry Byers about earlier in U.S. import demand and kind of what you're seeing on the export side of China versus the import side coming into the U.S. What are you seeing in those numbers right now?
Sure. Henry's report is great. It's fantastic. I loved what he wrote. The only issue I have, I got to say, is we saw Gene Soroka from the Port of LA on CNN. He's been making the news reports. And one of the problems we have is what is happening in U.S. ports. And I want to pair those rose-colored glasses that Gene has, because he sees very optimistic things right now when I don't think we're quite exactly there. Port of LA was down in April 6% in terms of imports. They were down the second half of 2021 in imports. And if you look over the last 3 months, they've barely ticked up at all. And they still have 25 ships waiting off the port right now. They are seeing an uptick in the number of containers in the port. The dwell number that we heard so much about over the past couple of months is kicking back up, including those containers over 9 days. And while I agree that consumption is down and people are buying less, the problem is the ports are backing up. And we're seeing that not just in LA and Long Beach, but now so much cargo is shifting through the Panama Canal. We got about a week-long wait to get through the Neo-Panamax lane of the Panama Canal. We're seeing congestion off of Savannah, New York, New Jersey. There's a lot of things going on in the ports right now that are not clearing the material out. And we could be in a very similar situation to what we had last year, with the ports backed up, with congestion and material not being able to move out of the ports because the warehouses and distribution sites are jammed up because they're not moving as much cargo as they did. We've basically over-ordered.
Last question for you, Sal. Yesterday's roundtable with Bill Priestley and our experts here, Thomas Wasson and Michael Vincent, Bill asked, good idea, bad idea to shift companies going from the West Coast to the East Coast because the Panama Canal doesn't have the capacity to handle it. I think I know your answer, but asking you, good idea or bad idea to make that shift?
It's very good to be diverse. I think putting all your eggs into one basket, which is LA Long Beach, it has been an issue from the very beginning. And I think a diverse port structure is a very important thing. It's something that we should be aiming for. And again, you can do this with Neo-Panamax vessels. Even though you only have one lane through the canal, it does cause a constraint. As long as you're managing it and controlling it, it's easy to do. The problem you have is there's still West Coast ports that are not being used to their full capacity: Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma. There's a lot of options that we can be using. The issue you have, again, is to make sure that we have a coherent national port strategy, which I fear we don't have. Instead, what we have is the individual ports competing with each other, battling each other for business, and that doesn't do good for the national strategy of how do we avoid port congestion in the future when this happens again, because we know it will happen again.
Sal, it's great having you on, as always, insightful as ever. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It's great to be with you guys. Have a good day.
You know what? We got to give him an apology for the Camels loss to Tennessee in the Super Regional Baseball. I had to mention it before we let you go, but you know who's still moving on? The Oklahoma Sooners. Boomer, baby. All right, we'll be back in just a few minutes right after this break. Don't go away.